The Wachau is the most famous stretch of the Danube in Austria. 36 kilometres of romantic Danube Valley. One of the oldest cultural landscapes with historical treasures and unique nature. Our journey through the Wachau begins in Stein, one of Austria's oldest cultural landscapes. Today's townscape of Krems brings back bygone days, a particularly beautifully preserved street complex. Through the bridge or Linzer Gate and stretching along the town is a narrow road that is protected on both sides by various buildings. More than 100 buildings provide an authentic picture of this old town. Today, the building's facades and entrances are decorated in the traditional way and show off the town's splendid Renaissance and medieval buildings. The appearance of some of these buildings was due to the artist Martin Johann Schmidt, known as Krems Schmidt, who lived here for almost 50 years. Here, the past is so vibrant that it's like visiting a fairy tale. Sacred monuments recall the victory of Catholicism over Protestantism, following 200 years of hostilities. The parish church of St. Nicholas was built in the 15th century and contains works by Krems Schmidt. The medieval rock fountain is located on a steep path that extends behind the church on a towering cliff that leads to numerous other buildings. Here, a second church rises almost protectively, the Frauenberg Church. On the top floor of the mighty tower was a fireguard's lodge that had a good view of the buildings below. The imposing Krems Gate guarded the opposite end of the town. Close by, the Danube and various jetties. Past the Cartoon Museum, the route leads to Krems. Krems can be entered from the west via the Steiner Gate, the last remaining gate of the town's 4 original medieval gates. Middle-class dwellings of different building periods, cobblestone streets, lanterns and fountains evoke pure nostalgia. The old main street continues to indicate the former wealth of the local people and has now been converted into a pedestrian zone. A stroll through the narrow lanes of the old town is fascinating. Magnificent middle-class houses and a small train that appears everywhere. Passing by fountains and columns, and along narrow streets with Italian-looking city palaces, whose well-preserved sgraffiti on the facades provides an insight into the daily life of times gone by. Krems is like a medieval fairy tale city, like the backdrop of a magnificent Hollywood movie. The Picturesque Church, also known as Frauenberg Church, is the oldest in the town. There are indications that from 1284, a Mary Church existed on the mountain slopes. This Gothic church was built on the ruins of a Romanesque church. The Jesuits defeated the Protestants and were later replaced by the Piarists. A covered staircase leads up from the old town where the church dominates everything. The interior architecture contains Gothic craftsmanship and Baroque furnishings. The high altar is an 18th century masterpiece. Krems is a living history of an unrivaled, centuries-old trade route between west and east. Up the Danube to Dürnstein. A place with a long history and unique appearance. Arrival by boat is particularly scenic. A jetty leads to a wall from where a gate and steps provide access to the old town. The small medieval town clings picturesquely to the cliffs above the Danube, guarded by castle ruins and fortified walls. An idyllic scene. A magnificent portal leads to the courtyard of an Augustinian canon monastery that dates back to 1410 and which was renovated in 1980. A second splendid portal leads from the courtyards of the church. Here, Provost Hieronymus Ubelbacher realized his ideas. He acted like a Baroque prince and had great artists working for him. The interior of the church is decorated with lavish Baroque, including the choir stalls and high altar. With a globe as tabernacle, a golden light above the altar, sacred figures, and a magnificent pipe organ. From the collegiate church, a passage leads directly to a terrace on Danube Rock. Adjoining the church is a Baroque cloister with expressive figures by Johann Schmidt and an ornate fresco. A narrow staircase leads down into a crypt chapel that contains allegorical frescoes by Miesbach and Pichler. A Baroque depiction of death and images of the provosts guards the entrance. In the crypt, there's also a Calvarian altar with 3 crosses. And wall and ceiling frescoes decorated with illustrations of the apocalypse as well as of mortality. In the monastery courtyard, daylight returns. As can be seen from its finely restored buildings, Dürnstein has been a popular settlement area since the Middle Ages. The Danube was romantic, but sometimes floods. In the middle of the 11th century, the Könige became the lords of Dürnstein, fortified the settlement, built a toll station as well as a castle. Since the clergy was not entitled to administrate worldly sovereign rights, such as tolls and various laws, the Königers took charge. Today only the ruins of Könige Castle exist above Dürnstein. The 16th and 17th century buildings and narrow streets were adorned with Bacchanalian Baroque in the 18th century by art-minded religious leaders. Dürnstein has always been influenced by the Danube, and its history continues to be reflected within its waters. In Roman times, vines were cultivated in this picturesque area due to the region's ideal growing conditions. Weissenkirchen has always been a wine-growing centre. The steep river valley and its terraced vine gardens enjoy a temperate climate. The small village has a long and dramatic history. Its old houses and lanes are indelibly evocative of the past. In 1258 it was mentioned in a document belonging to Alberto of Könring. Later monasteries cultivated vineyards. A line of houses directed towards the Danube is a captivating sight. Single-story, multicolored buildings with small courtyards. And in between, several inns that have long accommodated travelers in the Danube Valley. Below a fortified church is situated a most beautiful Renaissance arcade square surrounded by fortress-like ramparts. More than 76 steps lead up a staircase to a weir system in the church. The fortified church, built of brightly lit stones, gave the place its name. In 1531, the local people built it to protect against the invading Turks. It proved to be effective and withstood all attacks. Today, many people still visit this late Baroque church. The church's mighty defensive walls managed to survive the hostilities of those perilous times. Further upriver, on the same bank, lies the small village of St. Michael that is still protected by a fortified church. Mentioned for the first time in 987 AD, this was the starting point for the Christianization of the Danube Valley. On a rocky barrier extending to the Danube was built the mother church of the Wachau, on an ancient Celtic sacrificial site. In around 1500 AD, a Romanesque stone church was replaced by a late Gothic church, along with a defense system. Following a devastating fire in 1630, it was rebuilt and furnished according to early Baroque design. Its external appearance has been well preserved, and it looks the same now as it would have done in the Middle Ages. From the 9th century to 1504, Spitz was a Bavarian enclave located on the Danube that was owned by the Niederaltaich monastery and various counts. The 16th century parish church is located within a fine market square, flanked by the old buildings of the local vine growers. Wine brought prosperity here. The wine growers had magnificent courtyards that provided security as well as comfort. The church, consecrated to St. Mauritius, dates back to late Gothic times. Its interior highlights the sacred splendor of the 17th and 18th centuries. The pulpit with putti and saints. The high altar with angels and a painting of artist Schmidt, plus various side altars. Spitz is picturesquely embedded within its surrounding vineyards, and the legendary Thousand Bucket Mountain is an imposing sight. A settlement history of more than 4,000 years was confirmed by the discovery of young Stone Age graves. The first recorded history of it comes from the year 830 AD. A deed of donation from Ludwig the German to the Niederaltaich monastery. It was not only due to wine, but also to the trading of both wood and salt that Spitz attained an important position in the Middle Ages and at the beginning of modern times. From then, 2 castles, a church, and several middle-class buildings were known to be here. All this preserved splendor helps to explain why Spitz became the center of the Wachau World Cultural Heritage Site. The 700-year-old ruins of Aggstein overlook the Danube Valley. This was once the domain of the robber knights of the Könringe. They placed chains across the Danube in order to waylay passing ships prior to plundering them. The fortress was built on a mountain summit 300 meters above the river, so any approaching ships or enemies could be spotted well in advance. Life in the castle was hard, but religious faith was present here too, along with the well-preserved castle. It was here that fierce power struggles for control of the traffic of ships on the Danube originated. The brutality of the Kurnringer was unsurpassed. Today, it's only myths and legends that recall those times, as the fortress has long since fallen into decay. Stift Melk, situated on a steep rock above the Danube, both nature and architecture unite as one. A monastic rock, a remarkable Benedictine monastery. Where today the huge yellow monastery is reflected in the waters of the Danube, up until the end of the 11th century once stood a simple castle of the Babenberger dynasty. It's not surprising that Umberto Eco's novel, The Name of the Rose, originated here, because Melk is one of the most imposing monasteries in the Christian Occident. The Emperor Wing is reached by the Emperor's Staircase, which was intended for the accommodation of the court. Today, the Emperor's rooms are used as a museum in which are exhibited a number of famous treasures of monastic art. Collections of precious sacred art, arranged in various rooms according to epoch. Here there's also valuable bishop's clothing and panel paintings with medieval representations of religious history. Next, the marble hall was used both as a dining room and for celebrations, with frescoes and marble walls. Jakob Prantar built this gigantic Baroque bulwark of faith. The townspeople took advantage of the spiritual and cultural life that had developed here. A spiral staircase leads down into the monastery church, the center of the monastery. The sumptuous architecture of its interior is unique. And sarcophagi with saints decorate the side altars. The frescoes and altarpieces often illustrate St. Benedict and were painted by Trogger, Rothmeier and Bachmann. The pulpit was created by Peter Widderen, son-in-law of Jakob Prantar. And the high altar radiates with golden crown, angels and saints. The world-famous and highly detailed God's Fortress is of the most precious Baroque. An impressive sight. The monastery park with its pavilion and rose garden was created in 1750. The final addition to the palatial monastery complex. Over time, secular and monastic life were augmented. The Romans had a base and settlements here, and later the Benedictine monks had a monastery above the town. Since the year 2000, the Wachau has been a world cultural region, a gem on the long route of the Danube. a picturesque river valley where both medieval and Baroque create an exceptional atmosphere, and nature, the perfect setting.